Hello and welcome to the Learn English Lab. I'm Mike, and today we're diving deep into the IELTS listening test with the amazing Sarah. We're going to uncover some really effective strategies to help you just ace this crucial exam.
Thanks for having me, Mike. It's so great to be here, ready to help all our listeners unlock their listening potential.
So for anyone out there dreaming of studying, working, or living in an English-speaking country, the IELTS listening test is often a key hurdle to clear right.
It is, definitely. And what makes it particularly challenging is that it's assessing your understanding of spoken English. Across such diverse scenarios, from casual chats to lectures to, multi-speaker discussions, it's designed to make sure that you're truly equipped to handle all the nuances of an English-speaking environment.
Yeah, and if we kind of break down this test, it's got 4 sections each, getting progressively tougher, and you're going to encounter various accents, different question types like multiple choice matching, filling in maps or diagrams. It really covers a lot of ground.
Oh, it does. And here's the thing. You only get one shot at hearing each recording. There's no rewind, no second chances. So this means that really targeted preparation is absolutely essential. You need to be prepared for that speed, the accents and potential distractions. It's almost like training for a marathon. You wouldn't just show up on race day without putting in the work.
Well, that's a perfect analogy. So, Sarah, you've brought a 12-week study plan that looks incredibly helpful. Could you walk us through some of the key elements?
Of course. And the beauty of this plan is that it's adaptable. You can tailor it to fit your own individual pace and goals. So those initial weeks are all about just familiarizing yourself with the test format itself. Take a practice test to kind of gauge your current listening abilities. It's like a diagnostic test, but for your ears.
Oh, I love that. It's like taking inventory of your toolkit before diving into a major project.
Yeah. And then we shift the focus to vocabulary building. This is about zeroing in on common IELTS themes like education, travel, health, and the environment. Having a good grasp of these topics is really going to enhance your understanding of what you hear.
Makes total sense. And I like how the plan breaks down each question type. It makes it feel so much less daunting. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by a mountain of question styles, you can tackle them strategically one by one.
That's the strategy. It's not about cramming information, but developing those solid listening skills that extend beyond the exam. It's about cultivating those listening muscles for the long haul.
It's like equipping yourself for the marathon and not just a sprint to the finish line. What else is really crucial to this plan?
Well, another key element is the gradual shift from general listening practice to more IELTS-specific recordings as you progress. So you begin by tuning your ear to just English in general, and then you refine your focus to the specific language and style that's employed in the IELTS listening test.
It's almost like an athlete warming up before the big game, gradually increasing that intensity. Now, this all sounds great, but what about, those of us with busy schedules?
Even with just 20 minutes a day, you can make significant strides. The key is consistency. Choose those appropriate resources and stay focused during those 20 minutes. It's about quality over quantity.
Okay, so we've laid out a solid plan. Now let's get into some really practical listening strategies that can make our listeners, even more effective learners. Let's talk about active listening. What is it and why is it so important?
Active listening is really transformative. It's about engaging with that audio rather than just passively letting it wash over you. Think of it as a conversation where you're actively participating, processing information, and responding.
Right. So instead of just hearing words, you're actively trying to decipher the meaning and make connections. So how can our listeners actually become more active listeners?
Well, one fantastic technique is to summarize what you've heard every couple of minutes. Just pause and ask yourself, what was the main point? Who was speaking? What was their intention?
Well, that's a great tip. It forces you to stay focused and actually grasp those key takeaways. What are some other techniques we can use?
Another really powerful technique is shadowing. This involves repeating phrases right after the speaker, striving to match their pronunciation and their rhythm.
Shadowing. That sounds like a fun challenge. What materials would you recommend for our listeners to use for this?
Well, TED Talks are excellent for this, and even podcasts like ours. Choose a short clip, maybe a minute or two, and focus intently on mimicking the speaker's stress and intonation.
It's almost like synchronizing your ear and mouth, training them to work in perfect harmony.
Exactly. And, while we're talking about training our ears, let's not forget about accents. I know this can be a really big hurdle for a lot of people, especially since the IELTS listening test features a variety of English accents.
For sure. From British to Australian to American, it can sometimes feel like you're listening to entirely different languages. Do you have any advice on how to adapt to this challenge?
Definitely. One simple yet really effective approach is to diversify your listening sources. So tune in to the BBC for British English, ABC Australia for, Australian English, and NPR for American English.
It's like giving your ears a global workout, exposing them to all those different flavors of English. What are some fun ways we can make this happen?
Absolutely. Dive into some Aussie shows like Bluey or explore radio stations from various countries. Just turn it into a cultural adventure.
I love that. So making the learning process enjoyable is really key. Now let's talk about vocabulary. You're such a strong advocate for actively expanding, your word bank, particularly in the context of the IELTS. Can you elaborate on this a bit?
Vocabulary is definitely crucial, Mike. It's essential to be familiar with the words and phrases that are likely to appear in those IELTS recordings. The most effective way to achieve this is to actively jot down any new terms that you encounter during your practice sessions.
So always keep that vocabulary notebook handy. What are some other things we should do with those words?
Absolutely. Write them down, look up the definitions, and then review them daily. You'll be surprised how quickly your vocabulary expands with consistent effort.
Fantastic tips, Sarah. I'm already feeling so much more equipped to tackle this IELTS listening test. What are some other things our listeners should keep in mind as they embark on this journey?
Well, remember, consistency is key. Choosing the right resources is equally important, but most importantly, maintain that positive mindset. Mistakes aren't failures, they're valuable learning opportunities. And don't forget to prioritize self-care. Adequate sleep, regular breaks, and those focused practice sessions will go a long way.
Those are all excellent points. We're going to delve into more insights and strategies for conquering the IELTS listening test in the next part of our deep dive. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to our deep dive into IELTS listening. Sarah, we've covered the groundwork with the study plan and those essential strategies. Now let's get really practical. Can you share some targeted exercises that can help our listeners really sharpen those skills?
Absolutely, Mike. So let's start with some exercises that are tailored for those who are just beginning their IELTS journey, maybe aiming for a band 4 or 5. One of my favorites is word spotting. It's a simple but surprisingly effective way to train your ear to catch those keywords within a fast-paced audio clip.
Word spotting, okay. Like a game for your ears.
It is a bit like a game.
Yeah.
You listen to a short audio clip, maybe a minute or two, and you just jot down as many words as you can recognize. Then you replay it to confirm what you heard.
Oh, okay. So it's all about training yourself to pick out those familiar words from that rapid flow of speech. It sounds like a great way to build those foundational blocks of vocabulary.
Right. And as you practice, you'll find yourself recognizing more and more words, which can be a real confidence booster. Another excellent exercise for beginners is number practice. You'll encounter a lot of numbers and dates in the IELTS listening test, so getting comfortable with them is essential.
Especially considering how different accents can pronounce those numbers.
Exactly. So for this exercise, find a dialogue or recording that involves, prices, schedules, or any other type of numerical information, and listen carefully, write down every single number that you hear.
So if you hear something like, the tickets are $15 for the show on July 3rd, you'd write down 15 and 3rd. Got it. Now, what about some exercises for those aiming a bit higher?
Yeah, let's move on to exercises for our intermediate learners, those targeting a band 5 or 6. Summary completion is particularly helpful. This is a fantastic way to assess your ability to really grasp the main ideas of a longer monologue.
Okay, so it's like extracting the essence of what you've heard and condensing it into, a clear and concise summary.
Yes. You listen to a monologue maybe 3 to 5 minutes long and then try to complete a sentence like, the speaker discussed blank because blank.
For example, if you were listening to a talk about the benefits of exercise, you might fill in those blanks with, the speaker discussed the importance of regular exercise because it improves both physical and mental health.
That's a great example. Another valuable exercise for this level is matching practice. This hones your skills in connecting different pieces of information together, which is a skill that's often required in the IELTS listening test.
Right, like matching names with actions or opinions with speakers. I could see how that would be really valuable.
You often encounter questions where you need to link specific details to the right person or category. So find a sample question that involves matching and practice, linking those ideas accurately.
Okay, this is all really helpful. Now, what about our more advanced listeners, those aiming for like a band 7 or higher? What kind of exercises can push their skills to that next level?
For our advanced learners, we need exercises that really challenge their ability to understand those subtle nuances in more complex language. Paraphrase detection is one I highly recommend.
Paraphrase detection, that sounds interesting. What's the objective?
So the objective is to become adept at recognizing when ideas are being rephrased, which is something you'll encounter a lot in the IELTS listening test. So the audio might use one word or phrase, but the question will use a synonym or a different way of expressing the same concept.
So you need to train your ear to detect those subtle variations in language.
Exactly. A great way to practice is by listening to recordings from Section 4 of the IELTS listening test, which usually covers more academic topics. Pay close attention to how the questions rephrase the information that's presented in the audio. For example, the recording might say improve, but the question might use enhance instead.
Oh, so it's about training your brain to recognize that improve and enhance mean the same thing in this context. What other challenging exercises do you recommend for this level?
Map navigation is another challenging but incredibly effective exercise. It's all about following spatial directions and visualizing information. You'll listen to a set of directions such as the library is north of the park and the museum is west of the library. As you listen, try to sketch a simple map based on those directions.
Oh, so it's like mentally constructing a map as you listen. What a great way to test your comprehension and your ability to process spatial information.
Precisely. And this skill is especially valuable for those map labeling questions that you'll find in the IELTS listening test. These are just a few examples, of course. There are tons of other exercises and resources available online and in IELTS preparation books.
That's right. The key is to find exercises that really address your specific weaknesses and encourage you to step outside of your comfort zone. Growth happens when we push ourselves. Remember, practice doesn't have to be tedious. You can weave your interests into your learning process right.
Absolutely. If you're a film enthusiast, watch English films with subtitles. If you love music, listen to English songs and try to decipher the lyrics. Just make it fun and relevant to your life, and that learning process becomes much more enjoyable and effective.
So we've covered the study plan, explored those powerful listening strategies, and even delved into some specific exercises for different skill levels. I think it's time to bring all of this to life with some real-life examples. Would you agree, Sarah?
I couldn't agree more. Hearing how others have successfully navigated their IELTS journey can be so motivating. I have some really inspiring stories to share that I think our listeners will find really relatable.
Fantastic. I'm eager to hear them. All right, Sarah, let's hear those real-life IELTS success stories you know. I'm sure our listeners are really eager to learn how these strategies have actually played out for others.
Oh, they are inspiring, Mike. First up, let's talk about Priya, an engineer from India. She needed a band 7 to secure her Canadian visa, but her initial score was a band 6. She really found those pesky accents and the speed of the recordings quite challenging.
Oh, yeah, I can understand that. So how did she actually manage to turn things around?
Well, she diligently followed that 12-week study plan we talked about, really focusing on that accent adaptation, in those early weeks. Priya listened to the BBC and NPR daily and even utilized the shadowing technique that we discussed to really internalize those sounds.
That's a great approach, immersing yourself in those different accents to kind of retrain your ear.
Exactly, and to really sharpen her listening skills for those fast-paced academic recordings, she dedicated herself to transcribing TED Talks.
Wow, that's dedication. So what was the outcome of all of her hard work?
After about 10 weeks of consistent practice, she retook the IELTS and achieved a band 8. She actually shared with me that her most significant improvement was in those really challenging Section 3 and 4 recordings, which makes sense given her academic background and all of that targeted practice.
That is incredible. Proof that with the right strategies and a lot of effort, you can absolutely achieve those IELTS goals. Okay, tell us about another success story.
Next up, we have Ahmed, a student from Egypt who was aiming for a university in the UK. He initially scored a band 5 and actually found those everyday conversation recordings in sections 1 and 2 particularly difficult.
Oh, interesting. It's easy to assume that those earlier sections would be, simpler, but they can be tricky in their own way.
Oh, they absolutely can be, especially if you're not really accustomed to the informal language and those rapid-fire exchanges that you often find in those everyday scenarios.
Right. So what strategies did Ahmed employ to kind of overcome these challenges?
Well, he fully embraced that active listening technique that we discussed, making sure that he summarized what he heard every minute or so to maintain that focus. He also made a conscious effort to expand his vocabulary, particularly focusing on those travel-related terms like departure, itinerary, accommodation, things like that.
Oh, those are all words that are so likely to appear in those travel-themed recordings. That's really smart.
Yeah. And to get comfortable with numbers and dates, he practiced listening to flight announcements, jotting down those key details.
What a clever approach. So did all of this lead to success for Ahmed?
Absolutely. After just 8 weeks, he retook the IELTS and reached his target score of Band 7. He was particularly happy with his progress in, those everyday conversation recordings. It really demonstrated the power of focused practice.
Oh, that's fantastic. All right, Sarah, let's hear about one more success story before we wrap things up.
Okay, last but not least, we have Maria, a nurse from Brazil who was preparing to migrate to Australia. And when she first started preparing for the IELTS, she just felt overwhelmed, Her English wasn't as strong as she desired, and the whole test just felt like this massive hurdle.
Oh, I can only imagine. It's so understandable to feel discouraged when you're facing, such a challenging exam. So what did Maria do to kind of overcome those initial feelings of overwhelm?
Well, she started with those beginner-level exercises we discussed, like word spotting, just to build her confidence and acclimate to the sounds of English. Maria also incorporated those simulated test conditions into her practice really early on, getting used to the format and that pressure of the test.
So she was building those foundational skills and getting mentally prepared for test day.
Yes, exactly. And to make her practice even more relevant to her profession, she focused on listening to those health-related podcasts and doing those summary completion exercises that we talked about.
That's a brilliant way to make the learning process more engaging and meaningful. So what was the end result for Maria?
Well, after 12 weeks of consistent effort, she achieved a Band 6 on the IELTS, which met the requirements for her Australian visa. She was absolutely thrilled and felt so much more confident in her English abilities.
Wow, these stories are truly inspiring, Sarah. They really underscore the importance of, a solid study plans, those effective strategies, and most importantly, self-belief and dedicated effort.
I couldn't agree more, Mike.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into IELTS listening. I hope our listeners are feeling energized and equipped to really tackle this important exam. Remember, consistent practice, the right resources, a positive mindset, and self-care are your keys to success. Embrace the challenge, celebrate your progress, and never give up on your dreams of studying, working, or living in an English-speaking country. A huge thank you to Sarah for joining us today and sharing such valuable insights.
Oh, the pleasure was all mine, Mike. Thanks for having me.
And to all our fantastic listeners, thank you so much for tuning into the Learn English Lab. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this YouTube channel for more tips and resources to help you achieve your English language goals. We'll see you in the next episode. Hello and welcome back to the Learn English Lab. I'm Mike, and today we're going to be diving into something that I think causes a lot of anxiety for English learners.
Yeah.
And that's the IELTS listening section.
For sure.
Luckily, we've got Sarah here, an IELTS expert, kind of walk us through some of the things we need to know to be successful on this test.
Absolutely.
So Sarah, if you can imagine somebody who's listening to this and just feels overwhelmed by the IELTS listening section.
Yeah.
What's the one piece of comfort or the most important thing you want them to know?
I think probably just to recognize that it's a really consistent test. It's always 30 minutes. You have those 4 sections that kind of ramp up in difficulty. And they use a variety of accents, but because it is so consistent, once you've kind of got that format down, it's really predictable, and that can actually really work to your advantage.
Okay, so we know what we're up against, but what about all those different question types?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it can feel like a whole zoo of different things you got to remember.
Yeah, it's true. You will see a range. I mean, you'll have things like completing forms and notes and summaries and sentences, and then you have multiple choice and diagram labeling and maps and tables and flowcharts.
Right.
So yeah, it's a good idea to familiarize yourself with all those different question types beforehand so that when you go in on exam day, you're not totally thrown off by the format of the question.
Okay, so preparation's key.
Yeah.
But I bet a lot of people think that they can just listen passively, to English, and that's enough.
Yeah, it's just going to kind of magically osmosis. And
yeah.
Unfortunately, passive listening's not really going to cut it for the IELTS. You really want to be actively engaging with the material.
Okay.
And one tip that I would say for practice is to only listen once.
Okay.
Just like you would on the exam day, resist that urge to hit the replay button.
Oh.
Because getting used to that one-shot listening is so crucial.
That's a great point. It's all about mimicking exam conditions, right? So if you're practicing the same way that you're going to have to perform on the test day, it's just going to make you that much more comfortable and confident.
Exactly.
So what are some of the other ways that you would recommend people to practice effectively for the listening section?
Taking notes is really, really important as you're listening. Try and identify those keywords. Try and predict what the answer might be before you hear it. And then afterwards, don't just switch off once the audio's done. Spend a little bit of time comparing your notes to the transcript and kind of analyzing where you went wrong, where your comprehension perhaps faltered a little bit and you missed the answer.
Right. It's like detective work, almost figuring out,
Totally.
where your weak points are.
Yeah.
Cool. And then speaking of the test itself, are there any tactical tips that you found work well with your students?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the biggest ones is read the instructions, really carefully pay very close attention to any word count limits because they can be a bit sneaky sometimes. And then also remember that you don't lose marks for incorrect answers. So if you're not sure, I guess you might just get lucky.
That's a really great point because sometimes that test anxiety makes us overthink things or not even put anything down because we're scared of getting it wrong.
Yeah.
Right. So it's better to just take a shot.
Exactly.
All right. So Sarah, we've been talking a lot about the IELTS specifically, but what about just improving listening in general?
Yeah.
Something that's going to help people beyond just the exam.
Yeah, absolutely. You want skills that are going to go the distance. And that really comes down to improving your overall English listening comprehension.
Okay.
I mean, the better you are at understanding spoken English, the more confident you're going to feel communicating in real world situations. So that means travel conversations, watching movies, everything just becomes a bit easier.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's all about those real world applications.
Yeah.
What are some ways that you think people can immerse themselves in English that are actually fun and engaging? Because you don't want it to feel like a chore.
Right, for sure. I mean, conversations are absolutely gold. Don't be shy to chat with English speakers, either online or in person.
Yeah.
And of course, movies can be a fantastic tool as well, especially with English subtitles if you need them. So just find what you enjoy and try and make English listening a natural part of your day.
Yeah, I love that it shouldn't feel like pulling teeth.
Exactly.
Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive into IELTS listening, are there any final words of wisdom that you want to impart about approaching the listening section?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest pitfalls that people fall into is if they miss an answer, they kind of get hung up on it and it throws them completely off track for the rest of the test.
Yeah.
So if you do miss one, just let it go and focus on the question that's coming up.
Such good advice.
Yeah, because you can always go back at the end and guess if you have time.
That's a great tip. It's so easy to panic in those moments.
Oh, yeah.
But you've got to stay calm and just stay focused.
Absolutely.
Welcome back to Learn English Lab. We're still going strong, exploring all the ins and outs of the IELTS listening section. Before we took a break, we were talking about really immersing yourself in English.
Right.
For that overall improvement. But something I wanted to touch on was vocabulary.
Uh-huh.
I feel like a lot of people, when they're studying for tests especially, they kind of get into this mode of memorizing giant lists of words.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a really common trap, but it's not always the most effective way to learn.
Right.
Real vocabulary acquisition happens when you encounter words in context. You need to see how they're being used, get a feel for their nuances.
Yeah.
So rather than just sort of rote memorization, try and learn new vocabulary through those podcasts or movies or conversations we were talking about.
Yeah, it's about making those connections, understanding the meaning and how it all fits together.
Exactly. And, think about the kind of vocabulary that's actually going to come up on the IELTS as well. You're very likely to hear language related to everyday situations, academic discussions, things like that. So make sure you're getting exposure to those areas.
That's a great point. Tailor your input to the task at hand.
Yeah.
Now, switching gears a little bit to some common pitfalls, I've noticed that some learners tend to translate everything in their head as they're listening. What are your thoughts on that?
It's so natural, especially when you're learning a new language, but it can really slow you down and prevent you from fully grasping the flow of spoken English.
Okay.
You miss those subtle nuances if you're constantly stopping to translate in your head.
So how do we break free from that translation habit?
It's about training your brain to process English directly without that middle step. Think of it like learning a sport. At first you're thinking about every movement, but eventually it just becomes instinctive.
Right.
And it's the same with listening.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
All right, so let's dig into some specific strategies for tackling those IELTS listening questions. One thing that I know trips people up is signpost language.
Oh yeah, signpost language is so important. It's like those little clues that speakers drop to kind of guide you through the information. Things like, first, second, then next. They're like road signs helping you anticipate what's coming next.
So being able to recognize and use those signposts can really make a huge difference in how well you understand.
It can. And it's not always just single words. Sometimes it's a phrase or even just a change in tone that signals a shift in topic.
Right.
So the more you can tune into those subtle cues, the easier it'll be to follow along and catch those key answers.
That's expert-level advice right there.
Thanks.
Now, another area where people tend to get tripped up is spelling and capitalization.
Oh yeah, those little details can be a real pain.
Yes.
Especially on the IELTS listening test because it is all about accuracy.
Right.
So even a small spelling error can cost you points.
So how do we avoid those pesky spelling mistakes?
Honestly, don't get too hung up on spelling while you're listening. Focus on understanding the information. Jot down your answers as quickly as possible, and then you've got that transfer time at the end. So use that to double check everything.
That's a good strategy.
Yeah.
And what about capitalization? Any specific rules we should keep in mind?
I mean, the main thing is proper nouns, like names of people and places, organizations, days of the week, months of the year.
Yeah.
It's basic grammar, but it's easy to forget when you're under pressure.
Absolutely. And speaking of pressure, staying focused for that whole 30 minutes can be a challenge in itself.
It's a mental marathon for sure.
You need stamina.
You do.
So what can you do to build up that stamina?
Well, practice with authentic IELTS materials is really essential. The more you familiarize yourself with the format, the pace, the types of questions, the better equipped you'll be to maintain that focus. And beyond practice, think about your physical and mental state going into the exam. Get a good night's sleep, eat well, stay hydrated. You want to be at your peak.
That's such a crucial point.
Yeah.
It's not just about the academic prep, but it's about taking care of yourself.
Exactly.
Now let's talk about a classic mistake that I see students making. They hear an answer, they get excited, write it down, and then they miss a correction or a change that comes up later.
Oh, yeah. It's so easy to get caught up in that initial, aha moment, and then you kind of let your guard down.
Yes.
But remember, those speakers can be tricky. They might change their mind or clarify something, which totally changes the answer.
So how do we avoid falling into that trap?
It goes back to active listening. Don't just wait for keywords, really stay engaged, anticipate those twists and turns, and be prepared to adapt your answers as you go.
Okay.
It's a dynamic process. Sometimes the correct answer doesn't come until the very end.
It's like a puzzle where the pieces can shift around.
Exactly.
Okay, before we wrap up this part, I want to touch on something that I think can be a bit of a gray area for people, and that is dealing with similar words that pop up in both the questions and the audio.
Right. Yeah, it's easy to get tricked by those familiar sounding words.
Right.
But remember, the IELTS is testing your comprehension, not your ability to spot simple word matches.
Okay.
So you need to think critically.
So how can our listeners tell the difference between a genuine answer and a clever distractor?
Context all comes back to context. Just because a word appears in both the question and the audio doesn't necessarily mean it's the right answer.
Right.
You need to analyze the surrounding information, make sure the meaning truly aligns, and be on the lookout for synonyms or paraphrases.
Okay.
It might be testing your vocabulary range.
That's a good point. It's about thinking critically, not jumping at the first familiar word you hear.
Yeah.
Welcome back to the Learn English Lab for the final part of our IELTS listening deep dive. We've talked about so much already, from the test structure to practicing effectively, and even debunked some myths about the listening section. So Sarah, as we wrap things up, are there any really powerful strategies that you would recommend for people to just really maximize their performance on test day?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing we touched on earlier, but I really want to emphasize, is predicting answers. Okay. So before the audio even starts, take a look at those questions and try to guess what kind of information you're going to be listening for. Is it a name, a date, a location, a specific idea? And this just kind of primes your brain to be on the lookout for those details.
Right. It's like turning your brain into this answer-seeking missile.
Exactly. And while we're talking about getting in the zone mentally, let's not forget the power of positive self-talk.
Okay.
I know it sounds cheesy, but it's so easy to get caught up in those nerves and that test anxiety. But, you've put in the work, you've prepared, you're capable of doing well. So walk into that exam room believing in yourself, and don't let those nerves sabotage you.
I love this, Sarah. It's about tapping into that inner cheerleader.
Exactly.
Now, what about those last few minutes of the listening test?
Oh, yeah.
When you have that time to transfer your answers to the answer sheet.
Yeah.
Any tips for making the most of that time?
Absolutely. Use it wisely. I mean, double check your spelling, your capitalization. Make sure you haven't gone over any word limits. And if you've got some lingering doubts about an answer, don't be afraid to take an educated guess. Remember, there's no penalty for wrong answers, so it's always better to have something down than to leave it blank.
Those are golden words, Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
So as we wrap up our deep dive today, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought-provoking question.
Okay.
What's one thing that you would encourage our listeners to do today to make English listening a more regular and enjoyable part of their lives?
That's a great question. I would say find something you're genuinely interested in, whether it's a podcast, a TV show, a YouTube channel, a certain genre of music, and make it a habit to engage with that content in English, even if it's just for a few minutes each day. Consistency is key. And so is finding something that really sparks your curiosity. The more you immerse yourself, the more natural and effortless your listening will become.
That's fantastic advice, Sarah. And to all of our listeners out there, remember that achieving IELTS success and just overall fluency in English is a journey. It's not a sprint.
Right.
So embrace the process, find the joy in learning, and never underestimate the power of consistent effort. And of course, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Learn English Lab YouTube channel for more helpful IELTS advice and other language learning tips. Until next time, happy learning, everyone.